Thanks for tuning into the Sheet Metal Shaping Podcast, where we discuss the pursuit of sheet metal shaping education through traditional coach building techniques. My guest today on the show, all the way from Charlton, Massachusetts, the one and only Mr. Ray Sheline. How are you?
Hey, Ryan. Good to see you again. You're a regular in my shop. You let people know that. You've been at my shop probably about 6 times or so.
I have. Long-time mentor, long-time friend. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very, very good to see you on the show. I'm excited for this.
So I thought that, there's a lot of people have figured out who I am from my YouTube videos and also from my classes. But when I had my classes, I actually stopped my classes after 18 years in December. I had a 3-day class originally, then I morphed it into a 4-day class. And I just felt that it was very disruptive for my shop. And, when I was teaching the class, I gave people a little bit of background, but not a full background. So this is an opportunity for me to give a little history of where I came from and why I'm so interested in what I do. So it all starts with my grandfather, who is not my blood grandfather, but my step grandfather. My grandmother's first husband, my true grandfather, died in 1926. And if he hadn't died, you and I would not be talking. That totally changed my entire life. And it set my trajectory anyways, because my grandfather, the step-grandfather, became my father's stepfather. And my grandmother was a widow for, I think, about 12 years. So my father grew up a lot without a father. And my grandfather came into the picture. He was from Maine. He came down to Massachusetts, Worcester, Massachusetts, to get a job. And he somehow, I don't know all the history, but he met my grandmother. And my grandmother was a real gregarious person. And my step-grandfather, not so much. But he had a good mind for business and timing. And he decided he was going to be an entrepreneur. And his first venture was the TVs were coming on strong. This is like 1948 or so. And he bought a whole bunch of TVs and was going to retail them and make his profit and go on from there. Well, I think that whole venture only lasted like a month. And then he says, no, that's not going to work. There's just too much competition. So he rented a building down by the lake. Worcester, Mass is bordered by this lake, Lake Quinsigamon, and it's the demarcation zone between the next town, which would be Shrewsbury. The line goes right through the middle of the lake. So Shrewsbury and Worcester are divided by Lake Quinsigamon, a 7-mile-long lake on one side anyways. So my grandfather rented a building and started a little boat business, and it was really small. He had little rowboats and canoes, and it probably at that time all you had to do, we're talking like 49, 50 or something like that. He probably had to make a phone call and was able to get a Johnson Outboard motor dealership. And at that time, they only had maybe 3 or 4 models of motors, not really high horsepower, all small horsepower. And then he rented a spot right on the lake, and he did repairs, and so he had a sales place, which my grandmother ran, and he did the sales. And when I was a little kid, I remember going over to the sales place with my grandmother, and I'd spend the time there. Well, somewhere along the line in like 49 or 50, I don't know how he did it, but he bought like about 5 to 8 acres of land or so right on the lake. And you talk about luck and timing. It was perfect timing. And it was like the best spot on the entire lake. I mean, you just can't believe it. It was all covered. The lake was covered with cottages. Right. The heyday of the lake was probably like 1880 to 1910. A lot of the big companies in Worcester would have clubs, and their employees would come down to the lake on the weekends and stuff. And it was trolley cars that would bring you down to the lake. And then they built what's called an amusement park called White City, which they had all over the country. And that was a result of the Chicago World's Fair in like 1898. They had a White City. So this is a great amusement park. It was right down the street. So they had fireworks over the lake on 4th of July, and all the roller coaster, and they had a big swing out over the water. It was amazing. So my grandfather got this boat business going, and I don't know where the money came from, to tell you the truth, because he didn't have any money. I have no idea. So nope, that was never discussed. But he built a beautiful house. It was probably one of the nicest houses, a modern style house at that time in Shrewsbury on the lake in a commanding position. You could see like a mile down each way, left or right. And he sold a small lot to my father right next door. And my father built a standard 3-bedroom ranch. It was probably like 1,000 square feet or something. My grandfather was probably maybe 1,500 square feet, which that time was a big house. Because, and the property was a disaster when he bought it. It was all kind of these little hills with cottages all dotted out. And just so happens across the street was a sand and gravel yard. And they had all the equipment. And I think he made a deal with them where they came over and scooped it all out, sculpted the whole place perfectly. And they got all the gravel and sand and everything. And my grandfather built a beautiful facility for a boat showroom at his house. And I'm growing up as a kid right next door, literally 40 feet away from my grandmother's house. And I live in my grandmother's house right next door. I just walk next door. And so and my father was working for my grandfather at that time. They bought boats and usually in the Detroit area and Wisconsin. My father would drive a trailer out there and stuff. So all this is relevant because I was soaking this all in. I thought this is how everybody in the world lived. You had the successful business and you had your house right there. And, to me, it was amazing, And we were dirt poor. My grandfather was not necessarily dirt poor. He drove a Cadillac. He went to Florida on vacations every year, and he became a Chris Craft dealer. He had Johnson Outboard Motors, and the timing was just so perfect because all the people buying the boats had all gone through World War II, and prior to that, they had gone through the Depression. So when the early 50s came along and they had employment and they had jobs that were paying more, they want to have fun, and they came down to my grandfather's, and my grandfather didn't have to sell the boats sold themselves. and we had like 52 dock slips there, so it was a social event too. Every weekend there was like literally 50 to maybe sometimes 100 people there with their boats and their families, and they'd come down and they'd go out for the whole day with the boat and everything. It was just an amazing time. So about 1956, this is where the cars come into the picture. My grandfather had this idea of buying a boat tail car and using that as an advertising tool for his business. So what better car to buy than an Auburn Speedster? Well, he looked around, and I think it was local. He found somebody that had 3 Auburns. At this time, they're only 20 years old. So maybe a little more than 22 years old. So he got a 34 Auburn Cabriolet, which is an unbelievably nice car, a 35 Auburn Speedster, and a 35 Auburn Phaeton. All 3 cars, $900. and the 34 Cabriolet was a running and driving car.
Yeah.
So he flipped the Cabriolet to one of his boat customers at the time, and he just finished law school, and he had a little Century inboard that he was docking there. And my grandfather turned him on to vintage cars, and he became a lifelong vintage car guy. And he just died at like 96 years old 2 years ago. And you name the car, he had it. So my grandfather really set the hook in good on the vintage car stuff. So my grandfather, the skill set of restoring a car is pretty close to restoring a boat. All the boats were mahogany that time. You had to rebuild the motors. You had to refinish the mahogany. You had to reupholster them. So all those skill sets were already there. And my grandfather operated his business mostly with part-time help. And he would employ, and he never did much. He was just a businessman. He was pretty much hands-off. I probably didn't see him work himself, physically working more than 20 hours and the whole time, I was in his presence, But he would give people instructions and stuff, and it was pretty simple work. Restoring a car then was really simple. When he bought the Auburn, I was 5 years old. So I remember the car,
Yeah.
and he always had it. He sold that one, and he bought another one, and restored that one, and then he had another one. So he just loved Auburn's. And when you see an Auburn Speedster, they only made like a 35. They only made like 100 of them. So they were very rare. A lot of people never saw them. So
Sure.
he had no intent of going into the restoration business or anything. It was just something he had to do, was to restore this car. And there were parts available because the remains of the Auburn Carr Dusenberg company had been bought up, and eventually went to Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where this guy Glenn Pray bought all the parts and stuff. So you could buy, and just about any part. He had all these barns, and if you needed a tail light or something, he had it. So it was. And the restorations, they were just old cars, and they had been taken care of. They might have had a few dents in them, and the upholstery needed to be done over. And it was just so happened that my grandfather had this upholstery guy who did the wood of the boat of the upholstery. So he took over the upholstering aspect of it. So all new leather interior, new leather top, and the paint. We were spraying all kinds of stuff anyway, so that was no mystery there.
Yeah.
And restoring the motor was no mystery. And it's a supercharged straight 8, and it has a dual ratio rear axle. It's really cool stuff, and it's way advanced. So the Auburn Carr Dusenberg company was just so great. And so my grandfather sold the Phaeton off, sold the Cabriolet off, and he probably owned the Speedster for nothing. So he gets it done. It probably took him, I don't know, maybe a year or two. And then he joined all the clubs. He joined the Auburn Carr Dusenberg Club, and their big meet is in September in Auburn, Indiana. So him and my grandmother would drive out there in the late 50s and show the car off. And so he met a lot of people. And then his boat customers saw the car driving around the yard and stuff. And they drove really nice, and they sound nice. They're just so amazing. It's like they came from outer space or something. The styling is so great on them. So I was spoiled right from the get-go. That I thought all cars were like this. But so anyways, next thing you know, he had a couple people asking him to restore the car, and he's already got this flourishing boat business. And some reason, well, the boat business was April to September,
right?
And then in the winter, you winterize motors, you restore or refinish mahogany boats, you reupholster them and all that. But he'd lay off a lot of his part-time help, and he did a skeleton crew, and so
this was a good way to keep all of his staff, keep them going. This was a good way to keep all of his staff going throughout the winter months.
Now he says, "Geez, I don't know how it all happened," but he said, "I'm gonna start a restoration business."
Yeah.
So my grandmother died in 1959 when I was 8 years old. So my grandfather, who's my step grandfather, was not blood, and then he remarries like 3 months later. So my world was rocked at this point because a new, much younger woman comes in. She was like 20 years younger than my grandmother. He marries her, and I used to live in my grandfather's house. Now I'm no longer allowed over there. She doesn't want me over there.
Really?
I mean, I can go over there, but after a while, I was a nuisance. And then there was a gate that I had to go through, and there was a lock on the gate, So, but my grandfather was the only grandfather I ever knew. So I treated him like my grandfather. But now my grandmother's out of the picture. It's not the same. So, but I had full access to everything, and he didn't actually even call me grandson. He called me Ray, So I was always industrious, and for money, I needed money. So I had 3 paper routes when I was like 10 years old, and I always worked. I never had any aversion to work at all. So now I got an opportunity to work at my grandfather's. Not when my grandmother was alive. I mean, I worked with my grandmother doing some tasks and stuff, but I never got paid for it. But now I got a situation where I can work for my grandfather after school and get paid for it. So I got like 50 cents an hour. I was 12 years old. I mean, I mowed the lawn. he had a big old 6-wheel drive Dodge Power Wagon from World War II. And we put a big boom on it so you could lift wharves up and stuff, the docks and stuff, to put the barrels under them. And we pulled motors with it and all kinds of stuff. So I learned how to drive that, and I'd snow plow the yard. The yard was like, I don't know, a couple acres or something. It was all gravel. And everything was great except for the gravel yard, you know. So anyways, the task that I'd be assigned would be boat business, which was running simultaneously. So I, like 12, 13, 14 years old, I'm an outboard mechanic. So I learned mechanics by fixing Johnson outboard motors, you know, and it was pretty simple. I mean, change spark plugs, change points. And then one day I'd be doing that. And the next day I'd be paint removing on a Rolls Royce or something. Wow. My grandfather made good decisions as to what cars. He made a few mistakes that you couldn't bring in a low dollar car and restore it because you couldn't give him a good restoration. He was charging $25 an hour at this time. We're talking the early 60s. He eventually went up to, I think, $35 an hour. And
which is a fairly significant jump, like $10 an hour on 25 is what's that, 40%?
Well, that took like probably in the 70s that he went up to 35. And there was high inflation in the 70s too. In the early 74, 5, the inflation was really bad. So anyways, so I never knew what I was doing. I always asked for the assignment, and he would give me the assignment, and I did all the grunt work on the restorations. I would be doing paint removing, sandblasting, and then later I got the dismantling, and then I convinced him because I watched the other guys. We had a couple painters, and I watched those guys and said, okay, I can paint. Right. So I learned from those guys, and I would paint small parts like chassis parts and brackets and stuff like that with a spray gun. And I got better and better, and I could disassemble, and I kept track of things, and I could reassemble. The first car he gave me to actually do a lot was when I was, I think it was about 16 years old, and it was a Cunningham, and there's two Cunninghams. One, Briggs Cunningham, he's from Connecticut, a super wealthy guy that did sailing and all that stuff. And then he had the cars down in West Palm Beach, Florida, I think it was, and race cars and all that stuff. But there was another Cunningham company out of Buffalo, New York. So they had a V8 motor, and we got a Cunningham restoration in. And it wasn't a super valuable car, but the guy wanted it restored or something. It was an open Phaeton. And my grandfather signed me the job, and it got painted a white and black color. It was nothing really to write home about. And we didn't have the motor. He had somebody else do the motor. But I took that all apart. I cleaned it all up and repainted and assembled most of it when I was like 16. So that was probably the first job that I've ever did. And my grandfather saw that I could do this. So I was doing mechanics. I was doing restoration, all aspects of restoration, the painting or whatever.
So this is where you got your skills. This was the very beginning, is what you're saying.
Well, these are the infancy of the skills. And then what happened was, as my grandfather's business grew, in like 1963, he landed this local multimillionaire, a guy that was born with a silver spoon. I don't think he ever worked in his life. His father had built the business, and somewhere along the line, he decided he was going to start a car collection. So he bought this property with a big barn, and he started buying cars. And he found my grandfather, and the first thing he wanted was a Dusenberg, a J. Dusenberg. So we hadn't had a Dusenberg in the shop. We had packets and stuff like that, and that Cunningham. Well, actually, the Cunningham came later. But we had some pretty significant cars. But now we got a J. Dusenberg. My grandfather went out and bought it for him. Went to an auction or something and bought it. And it was like 1963 and drags it back. Well, they only made a run of 500 Dusenberg chassis. Yeah. And that was in like 1928 that they did it. So the Dusenberg story is so amazing. I mean, there should be a movie about it. It's terrible that there isn't. And once you see a Dusenberg, your whole life changed. So I mean, it's so incredible. I mean, here's a car designed in 1928 It's got a straight 8 motor with double overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder. Some of them had superchargers. With a supercharger with 320 horsepower. So it's just absolutely a mind blower. And you just see the way the whole thing's put together. It's very, very solid. I mean, technically advanced as far as the motor goes, the chassis. It was just a big, heavy truck chassis. I didn't personally ever drive one, but I think, it didn't have power steering or anything. You had to be moving to steer it. And they probably weren't the best cars to drive. Like the car today would outperform it by miles, but it was just so prestigious.
Yeah.
And most of them were all coach built.
Right.
And meaning
you bought the chassis and then had the body commissioned, right?
Yeah, they sent the chassis out. The chassis would include the fenders, which were stamped, the cowl, the radiator shell, and the cowl would be just a firewall, not the actual sheet metal. So, and the firewall was a big giant casting that was all polished towards the engine. And it's just gorgeous stuff.
Yeah.
And the story of it, I don't know if it's ever been told, but the Dusenberg brothers, Fred and Augie, it's just an amazing story, and it should be told. And I think it's great, much better story than Enzo Ferrari's story or something. But it probably never be told. Unfortunately, maybe nobody knows the intimate details, but the Dusenberg brothers were failures as far as business goes. So Carr ended up buying the Dusenberg assets, and he brought them in as employees, and they designed everything. And it was sort of like they were following the dictate of Carr, who wanted the most prestigious car, and he wanted it to be an American car, and he had the best people to do it with Fred and Augie Dusenberg.
Yeah.
So they basically had a blank check probably to do stuff, but Carr was dictating how it was going to happen. So it's an amazing thing. If Fred had his way, it probably would have been so much better. But that said, I mean, there's nothing like it. I mean, at that time, there was no car made in the world as good as a Dusenberg. I mean, there's Zada Francinis and Hispano Suezers and Rolls Royces that are in the neighborhood, but they can't outperform a Dusenberg.
So at what point in your early stages did you realize, coach building is more my thing, lesser so on the mechanical side?
At that point, I had no idea, absolutely no idea. I was more entranced with the mechanical end of it and stuff, and then what happened was the one Dusenberg begat another Dusenberg. So next thing you know, we always have like 6 Dusenbergs in the shop. Yeah. Now we had a couple Packards, we had a couple Studses, we had a couple Bentleys and Rollsers, but it was always the top line cars that we were dealing with. And that's, if you're going to be in business, you have to be dealing with the better cars, so that you have customers that can pay you. That's right. The whole deal, And I was totally oblivious to the economics of it. My grandfather was handling that, And
that was actually one of the topics of the show today, was the economics of the coach building craft.
We'll swerve into it. So anyways, my grandfather hired a guy, what happened was my grandfather made all these connections with people in the Dusenberg circles and the Packard circles and everything. And there was a couple dealers at that time, Leo Gephardt from Ohio. He was like one of the biggest guys out there buying and selling cars. And he had started in like 1950 buying and selling cars. And another guy I don't know too much about, but his name was Tiny Gould. He was a big, heavy guy, hence Tiny. And they both approached my grandfather and said, look, I've got a Dusenberg chassis. Can you make a body? So that was a pivotal moment, because there again is the motivation to do something. Right. You have to do it on somebody's nickel. So these guys were willing to pay my grandfather to get a body made. So my grandfather, at that time, late 60s, early 70s, you could hire skilled help locally, no problem, So the bodies are ash wooden frame bodies, and we had one that was called a Durham Torster. It was owned by one of the customers, this guy Pascucci from Connecticut, who owned restaurants, and he had at least a dozen Dusenbergs. And he just kept feeding one after another to be restored. And one of them was this Durham toaster. And Durham was a company out of Rosemont, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Philadelphia. And they were in business for almost, 80 years or something, like building all kinds of coach building stuff. And they were famous for building these Durham toasters, which I think they made 6 of them. Gary Cooper owned one. And at that time in the club, in the Auburn Court Dusenberg Club, they were considered one of the best designs. It's a very minimalist design. The body is super simple. So that worked in my favor. My grandfather's, we had no skills. We had no tools, no skills or anything. But he could hire the woodworkers to copy the wood inner structure, which defined the body. And you didn't need any bucker or anything. So we had a mechanic, local guy, who had a brother who was an auto body guy, and we ended up hiring him. And he was very resourceful, and he wanted to learn how to do this, so he learned how to gas weld aluminum, and he actually made the skins around the wood inner structure that these 3 woodworkers that we hired. So I'm absorbing all this stuff. I used to work with the woodworkers, and they taught me a lot of that stuff, so I know how to do all that stuff. And I watched Franny was doing the panel work. And the panel work, there was no such thing as an English wheel. We didn't know what an English wheel was, or a power hammer or anything like that. We had no tools. I mean, zero. It was just hammer and dolly. And
now, is it that you didn't know what they were because they didn't exist in your location?
Well, they were few and far between. And my grandfather was a victim of the Depression. He would not spend any money.
Right.
We just had no tools. The only tool that was decent, he bought a pretty decent big bandsaw because the woodworkers insisted that he buy this bandsaw. So other than that, we didn't have a bending brake in the shop, And at first, the shop, we took over the boat part of the shop, but then he ended up selling that part of the property to a company that wanted to put condos up. And they built these condos, and we moved into a 5,000 square foot warehouse that we used to store the boats in. And that became the restoration shop, which still exists, and it actually is still functioning with one of the last employees of my grandfather, who's done a really nice job. And he did a lot of Dusenbergs too after my grandfather passed on in like 82. So
did you guys ever track where those Dusenbergs went? I'm sure they've been dispersed over the years.
Oh yeah, they went everywhere. They probably sold 20 times since then, So anyways, my grandfather had this potential of building these bodies, and now the process is underway, and we got 2 or 3 bodies being built at once. And Franny's hammering away with a hammer and dolly to put a little bit of crown in the door skins and stuff. Yeah. And the tops of the doors are hammer formed around the wood. You just anneal the aluminum and hammer form it around. So I didn't really learn too much there, as far as, just hammer and dolly work, and I was never any good at it. So what happened was, and this is where I come into the picture, I mean, I'm doing all these jobs there. I didn't do any of the skinning at all. I just watched. I made a lot of little parts and stuff, and I always kept busy. So my grandfather hired this guy who came in, and he was 20 years older than me, and he was into Jags and like some of the Fords, the 34 Ford, 35 Ford and stuff like that. So he had a couple of the Fords, and he had like 20 Jags or 18 Jags. And he had a lot of acreage in a rural area with an old farmhouse. And his wife worked, and he never worked. So he just played with his cars, and he decided he was going to learn something by coming to work at my grandfather's. So my grandfather hired him. And he only worked for about a month or 2, but we became good friends. We had really good conversations. And he told me, because he was a Jag guy, he wanted to build a C-type Jag. And he had it all planned out in his head how he was going to do it. And he told me, you got to get this thing called the English wheel, and I might have heard the term before, but he says, yeah, you can make this English wheel, and he was very lazy, so he never ever made an English wheel. Why at that point? So he planted the seed. So I worked for my grandfather until 1975, and I felt that at 75 I was 24, and I felt that my grandfather was getting older. Okay, maybe I could take the business over, and he could mentor me to run the economics of it. But because he wasn't blood, it didn't happen. So I had to go off on my own, and I never made any money there. He always did pretty well. Again, he always had a brand new caddy and always taking vacations and stuff, and he didn't have to work. So that was my learning curve. I learned a lot about restoration, a little bit about shaping, and my friend Joe, who had the Jags, he taught me that you need this English wheel. And 75, I leave, and I think I'm going to start a restoration business. Well, I got no money. I have no money. And so next thing that happens is a couple years go by, and I get this opportunity to buy this property. Well, I still don't have any money, but I got a great opportunity to buy a piece of property. And it's on a nice U.S. highway, the same highway that my building is on now that I lease. And well-trafficked road. It's an old road. It's called the Boston Post Road, Route 20. And it actually goes all the way to Washington State, crosses the country. It was one of the first transcontinental roads. And so I bought a property on it with 2 acres, and I'm going to put up a restoration shop. And I bought the property with owner financing. And I hooked up with my wife. We weren't married at the time. We bought it when we were unmarried. And I said, what are we going to do? So at first I went to work for a car dealership where my father worked. My father had left my grandfather's, and he became a car salesman. So he says to me, he says, well, you don't have money for a building. Why don't you just, you got a lot there and you got good exposure. Why don't you buy and sell cars? I says, well, I don't know anything about that. So all I knew was I knew how to fix cars. So I says, okay, I'll do that for a couple of years, make some money, and put a building up. So it turned out I did it for like 8 years. I learned how to deal with the public, and I actually kind of enjoyed it. And I learned how to do repairs quickly. And I wasn't smart enough to flip a car and make a profit. I had to restore a car and make a profit. So I fixed them all up. I put new brakes in them. I put new exhaust systems and all that. I painted them. I had a small building to work with. I had like a 4-car garage, and it was really ramshackle. The town didn't want me working in the building, but I worked in it anyways. And next thing you know, a guy came by and offered me a big number for the property. At that time, it was huge. So, okay, so now I can buy a brand new house and pay cash for it, or I can buy a building. That was my biggest mistake. I went and bought a house and paid cash for it. And I moved like 20 miles west, where you can buy a lot more house by moving 20 miles. So, I thought I had a pretty nice house, a nice lot, nice town, the best street in the town. And my wife was happy. She was working. And I says, okay, I'll work out of my 2-car garage for a little while. First, I was going to do restoration. So I got a couple little restoration jobs. And one was a 48 Lincoln Continental. And I did all the metal work on that. And I had no idea what I'm doing. I bought a MIG welder in the 70s when I was still
a Lincoln Continental.
No, it was a Montgomery Ward MIG welder. And they were made by what's the can? Century Manufacturing, which is out of Chicago. And they made Snap-on, the same Snap-on MIG welder. So it was like a Snap-on MIG welder.
Yeah.
And it worked pretty good. And I learned how to MIG weld. I could gas weld, but TIG welding, I didn't even consider TIG welding. So I fixed this 48 Lincoln up for this guy, did all the panel work on it. And then the guy that bought my grandfather's 34 Cabriolet became the car collector. He had bought a 1935 dual cowl Dietrich Phaeton, and it's a very valuable car. And he bought a bunch of pieces, and it needed to be put all together. And he had somebody start to do the job back in like 1970, and the guy flubbed it and he put it in storage. So now from 70 to now it's like 85 or 86. He offers me the job of putting the car together, which means I have to do all the wood, and there was a door missing, and it was a lot of metal work, the fenders, and the car was just a pile of parts. That was it.
Yeah.
So I put that together for him, and my intent was just to do the metal work. And meanwhile, I'm still friends with my friend that has all the Jaguars and introduced me to the idea of the English wheel. And he had all these XK Jags. I came up with the idea of making XK Jaguar parts, which if you had an XK Jaguar, you had to get them from England. So I figured, well, the shipping cost must be, too high. So I'd have a big advantage. And who else was going to make them? So somebody had to make them.
Right.
So I'm in my 2-car garage, and I figured, oh, this is a nice little business. I'll grow it out of there. I did a little bit of restoration work, but then the restoration work went away. The package was down in the basement. I had a 2-car garage down the basement as well. And I finished the package up down there as much as I could. And that was an ongoing job for a year or two, maybe, putting it all together. And then meanwhile, I started this mail order business through Hemmings, making XK parts. And I had all these samples that my friend had let me have the samples. So I had to reverse engineer them. All skill sets I learned at my grandfather's. I knew how to measure. Measuring is the most important thing. If you don't measure right, you're not going to get a pot proper. So I decided that I didn't want people buying my parts and having them calling me up saying, my God, this pot doesn't fit. What are you going to do about it? So I made sure that I did them really nicely.
Yeah.
And I built an English wheel. Ron Fournier's book had come out, and I looked at a picture of a fabricated English wheel in there. I says, oh, I can make that. And I had my Montgomery Ward MIG welder, and I had a stick welder. And it was 4x4 1/4-inch wall tubing. I made it an English wheel. And I made it with a straight up bottom anvil holder. Yep. So as I started making the Jag pots, I found out that you don't want that. You want a canted lower arm because your panels always hit that upright, and it just tore the panels up, tore the machine up and stuff. And I said, if I ever make another wheel, I'm going to have a canted lower arm. So and a top adjuster I put on it. That was a kind of a fluke. But I soon determined that it was so much easier to use a top adjuster than trying to kick that bottom adjuster.
Right.
So this was all pre-internet, and I had nobody to ask for when I'm building these Jag parts. And I thought people would be calling me looking for all fender repairs, new fenders, and all this stuff. And ultimately, I had no idea what I was doing on that stuff, on the fabricated inner structure, like the rocker sills and the floorboards and all that. I can figure that all out. That's all brake bend stuff. I bought a brake and I had that all under control. But now to make the compound curve stuff, I had to learn by videos. Well, videos were starting to come out, and there was a guy in Florida, Cal Davis. And he was an auto body guy, and he was in, I think, McLenny, Florida or something. Him and his wife, Joyce, they started a little business, and they befriended John Glover, who was an English-trained patent wheeler. And he had worked for General Motors in the prototype department, and he'd worked for de Havilland Aircraft, and he was a superb English craftsman. So they did videos of him.
So we're really coming into the era here of sheet metal education. Like this is kind of this is the grassroots. We're coming into the era of sheet metal education. Before that, it was shrouded, or?
Well, yeah, prior to, this is like from 1985 on.
Yeah.
Prior to 1985, nobody knew how to do this other than a handful of racing guys, and maybe, I would say probably less than 50 people in the whole country. Yeah. And oftentimes, if Briggs Cunningham, when he had his facility in West Palm Beach, Florida, if he needed somebody who knew how to do sheet metal shaping, they would import an English craftsman and have him live there and work for him. And, that's just how it happened. And a lot of the big shops probably did that. They'd bring this outside labor from England in, and then that solved the problem. But by 85, the whole scene of the collector cars, and we're talking the upper crust of collector cars, the Rolls Royce, the Bentleys, the Dusenbergs, the Packards, the Pierce Arrows, all that stuff, the value was rising so much that, and you couldn't find parts anymore. So now that was the stimulus to learn these new skill sets. Yeah. So the restoration shops, now they had to make a fender. They couldn't buy one at Hershey anymore. They no longer existed.
Right.
So they had to learn the skill sets. And I heard Bobby Walden's interview the other day that when you did, I watched it, and he went to Scott Knight, and he mentioned that Scott Knight was an alumni of California Metal Shaping, and he was sort of like the font of a lot of this spread of information. And I never went to his class, but I did see a video. He started videoing some of his first class, and a guy here, actually in the town I'm in, Charlton, had a restoration shop, and he went to one of his classes and had the video, and I watched the video, and I learned a ton from that. I could see how he's operating both his classes and what he was doing, and after he started teaching, one of the students was Fay Butler, and then Fay Butler started teaching. Well, it just so happens that my friend Joe, who had all the Jags, somehow got to know Fay Butler, and he told me, "Oh, this guy's got these big hammers, and you got to come out and see him," and all this. So I went over there, and I saw his hammers, and I knew my situation with the garage. And Fay's got a class on at that time, and he's trying to get me to go to the class, but I says, "There's no way." He doesn't have an English wheel. He doesn't know anything about English wheels. I says, "I can't put a hammer in my garage." So I just didn't have the room for it. And I wasn't ready to launch out of the garage yet. As it turns out, as another big error in my life, I spent 25 years in that garage. And those 25 years were learning all the nuts and bolts of how to do shaping. So my medium was XK Jaguar stuff, and I compare it to like the Beatles going to Hamburg. That's where they became musicians, because they played like 6 to 8 hours a day, every day, and that repetition is where you really learn. And that really hammered it home to me. And I had this substandard English wheel, and the next thing was, how can I speed things up a little bit? Well, the enticement of the hammer, it's always the hammer can make things go faster. Well, I opened up an Automobile Quarterly that I had found somewhere, and it had a picture of an Italian-style hammer, which is this the big arm deal. Sosa Metalworks makes one now. They call it the what's it? The what?
Shape-O-Matic?
Shape-O-Matic, yeah, but his is a real small arm and stuff. I made mine look like what the Italians did with a wooden arm, and it's real slow as far as the hammer, really controllable. And any shaped part that I made after I made that in like '93, because I would pound them out all by hand. But after I built that hammer and learned how to use it, and it took me a year to learn. It didn't take up any space because it uses the floor as a structural element. You just bolt it to the floor, and it has quite a wallop. And I figured out you can shrink with it, so you can stretch and shrink at will. And you don't need special dies or anything. I just used Delrin dies, and in fact, I used UHMW dies at that time, which is cheaper than Delrin. And I could pop out the Jag panels pretty quick. And this was all discovery on my part. And what was happening at that time was it was the power hammer community was growing leaps and bounds, because the perception was the English wheel is super slow and the power hammer is super fast.
Right.
So a lot of people went to the power hammer and it kind of ignored the potential of the English wheel. Well, not only did I build that Italian style hammer just from a picture, it took me a month to build it.
Mhm.
And, my skill sets back in 93 are not like what they are now. So it worked okay, and it's never failed. I still could use it tomorrow if I want to. And I decided that the wheel that I had made, which had like, I don't know, 40-inch throat or so, I was going to make a monster. So now I went to the scrapyard. We had 3 scrapyards really close by, and I bought all these I-beams and tubes and all kinds of stuff. And I made this 57-inch throat English wheel. And I had the idea that a wider top wheel was a much better thing than a standard 3-inch wheel. As soon as I made the new top wheel, which I didn't make it, I went to the scrapyard and I found a really nice hardened wheel that I could use. I just had to put bearings in it. And the first one I had, I think, was pretty concentric. I didn't have to do too much to it. But then I had to make bigger anvils, and I had a little lathe that I bought, and it was really pushing the limitations of that lathe. And I made new anvils. And once I started using this, it's like night and day.
Yeah.
So people compare English wheels to power hammers. That's apples and oranges. When you have proper English wheel with proper tooling, now you're on the same playing field with the power hammer. Well, the power hammer can shrink like crazy with the thumbnail die. You can't shrink with an English wheel, but there are other ways to shrink. And so I had to learn other ways to shrink. One of them was on my Italian style hammer, that I could shrink pretty easily with that. But you could only shrink in about 2 inches. With a power hammer, with a thumbnail die, you can technically go in, whatever the throat is on the power hammer. But in practicality, you never shrink that far in. All you need to do is shrink, from 2 to 6 inches or so, depending on the situation, the panel you're making. And that speeds up the event quite a bit. So if you have the ability to shrink the edges, that's a good thing. So I used my Italian style power hammer for years to shrink with. And that worked fine for the Jaguar parts. All the shrink marks totally came out. The panels were perfect. There's a difference between the thickness. In the crown of the panel, it might be 4 or 5 thousandths of an inch thinner, and it might be 2 or 3 thousandths thicker on the edge. On a Yoder or a power hammer, the thickness of the center of the panel can maintain almost what you start with. You might maybe lose a thousandths in the final planish or whatever, but your edge thickness might go up 4 or 5 thousandths. So that's the only difference. And it's immaterial. As long as the panel that you make can pass the dent resistance test, which is to hit it hard with your knuckles and not make a mark on it, because you can easily dent any automotive panel. So, but if you can resist a good wrap of the knuckles, that's proof positive you're doing the right thing.
Right.
You're not making the panel totally by stretching it. So you have the ability to stretch and shrink. And I love the way the English wheel planishes out, and the fact it doesn't make any noise. So that was a big factor for me. I couldn't make noise in my 2-car garage.
How close were your neighbors? Were they close?
I had one neighbor. He was about 100 feet away, and they were never there. I could have probably made noise. And I had my Italian hammer in my 2-car garage, and my daughter went for a walk down the side street, and it was about a quarter of a mile away. And the guy said to my daughter, "What's your father doing in that garage? He makes a lot of noise." So I said, "Oh shit!" So I moved the hammer down into the basement, which he couldn't hear then. So it was a little inconvenient. I had to walk down the basement for that, but it wasn't that bad. Of course, I ruined my knees going down all the steps. So I need 2 knees now.
This was for 25 years, right?
25 years going up and down steps. Yeah. So anyways, I worked. I got better and better and better. But I was making a moderate living. You couldn't hire anybody. I had a couple of helpers, part-time helpers under the table type of stuff, and they were my daughter's friends. They were cutting pieces out, punching holes, and all that. Yeah. And then I bought a CNC plasma cutter, and that was $10,000, and that made a big difference. Because now I could make English wheels. So I figured, I could supplement my income. I'll start making English wheels. and I designed a nice roundish English wheel. And I found out quickly that it was too labor intensive to make, and it was impossible to make any money on it. But it was great having the plasma cutter because I could make all kinds of different tools and brackets and all kinds of stuff. So that was a big step forward, spending the money on that plasma cutter. And then the plasma cutter became the source of how I could make shrinking discs. The shrinking discs have been my little money maker through the years. So I started making shrinking discs. It was actually Scott Knight who gave the classes. I don't know who came up with it, or he did, or somebody knows, or whatever. He started selling the shrinking discs, which are now sold by Sun Chaser Tools. What's his name? Yakumo.
Sakamoto.
Ken Sakamoto. Yes.
Yeah. Who
worked for Scott Knight in the early years, and he bought the shrinking disc business from him, I guess.
No.
So I bought two shrinking discs from Scott Knight back then, and it came with a little mimeograph thing that had these ruffles all on the edges that you run it on the concrete floor to kill the outer edge, because otherwise it'll tear up your panel. And then as the internet came in, everybody in '95, the internet came in for everybody, and I helped start a group called Metal Shapers. And then Metal Meat I started with a friend, and he did all the web work, Dave Miller from Nashville. And in exchange for working on his Lotus, he built the site for me, and that was like building the first community of shapers and stuff. It was fun, but I got forumed out pretty quick because people get really nasty on forums, and I didn't have time for it, and I was spending too much time on the forum. I tend to go overboard on stuff. So anyway,
early 2000s.
Yeah, the Metal Shapers started at 2000s. Then I organized with George King, who was from Huntsville, Alabama. His father had this basically $1 billion company, and he had a beautiful 7,000 square foot play shop. And Tom Lipton, who has a really cool YouTube channel called Ox Tools. He's a machinist, superb machinist. Mm-hmm. The three of us put together a plan that we'd all go to George's, and we ended up having, I don't know, about 60 people or something from the from the Metal Shapers site, go to Huntsville. And I think we did the Huntsville thing 2 years. And I was trying to get everybody to scratch build cars. And we scratch built a couple bodies, but it was a crazy mess. And it was a lot of fun. The first one was fun. The second one was fun. And then we moved it to Illinois, with one of the guys we met from Huntsville, who had a big 5-acre lot or 6-acre lot, Randy Ferguson. He said, "Oh, we can have it in my yard." So yeah. I said, okay. He had a big building, but he didn't have access to the whole building. So we rented a tent. And we had the Metal Meat in a tent. And that's a whole funny story, is that one year the tent, it had rained for like a week before the event, and the ground was all soggy, and it was probably like 3 feet of topsoil there. So they said, "What do you want? What steaks do you want? Do you want the short steaks or long steaks?" Well, it was more money for the long steaks, and Randy opted for the short steaks. So we got this enormous tent. It's like 200 feet by 100 feet in his backyard, with like 135 people in it, and it's all muddy. So we put this straw down. We're talking like 100 bales of straw we had to buy and put on the ground, and people are grinding and sparks are going.
Yeah,
there's a disaster waiting to happen. So this is, I think, 2004, and we had different lectures and stuff. And there's a couple guys that came in, gave lectures. I gave lectures on how to do this, how to do that, and we were still in our infancy. I mean, everybody was still learning at that time. And I didn't really know how to present really well at that time either. I was very shy. And the one guy from Washington State decided to, because it was getting hot in the tent, he was going to lift the sides up. He lifts the sides up, and there's like these gusts of 50-mile-an-hour winds coming into the tent and blowing the tent up, and pulled the stakes out. and there's like 100 people at least inside this tent, and the tent collapsed on them.
Oh no!
Nobody got hurt.
Yeah,
amazingly. But the local TV came out and video and all kinds of stuff. And we rolled this tent up, and there was these bubbles in the tent. And I says, "Oh, I just hope there's nobody in that bubble."
It's so funny
because we didn't have accounting or anything.
Wow.
So
did you guys have full machines in there too? Like, did somebody bring?
Yeah, everybody brought stuff, and everybody brought trailer, stuff in. And then after that, they decided that they could rent these local fairgrounds.
Yeah.
And I pretty much had it after that, and I left. I went to see the fairgrounds, but I never actually participated in the fairgrounds. It was a fun premise, and I was instrumental in getting going, and I'm sure a lot of people benefited from it, but it's not for me. So I started doing classes in 2005. People kept saying, "Oh, you should do classes." So I had the classes. I was still at my house at that time, and I would have 3 people come to do the class.
Yeah.
And they would bring, this rusty old Ford Fender, and we'd spend 2 days taking the rust off, And, I was never a Ford guy. I was always a Packard and a Dusenberg guy, So I was probably an elitist snob to them. But, that I learned very early that if you're going to do this stuff, you have to have the value. And this is where the economics of it come in, So finally in 2011, it was time for me to get out of my 2-car garage. So I couldn't afford to buy anything. I didn't have any money. I never made any money, but I had a lot of fun. I have no regrets. It was a lot of fun. My learning curve just kept going better and better and better. So I was able to rent a small building. It was 3,000 square. No. 3,000 square feet, and it was like $1,200 a month in an old factory building about a half an hour from my house in Connecticut. So it just so happens there's a 1/4-mile racetrack right down the street from where this building was. So I thought, oh boy, that's going to be good. All these people would come in, and my business is going to roar. Not one of them ever came in. Nobody. They're totally uninterested. I'd have an open house, and I'd get maybe 2 or 3 people come in.
Yeah.
So I started there. I had no employees. It was all by myself. And the only employees I had were those kids working under the table part-time for me. And now it became apparent. I got a couple of jobs in that I had to have employees. And, I was doing a little restoration work. I was still doing Jag work. I was trying to make English wheels. So it was kind of scattered around. And I knew that being scattered around was the problem. But I couldn't handle all the work. So I ended up hiring one of my first students, this guy, Jack, who was really good, but he was super slow. And that's a problem with a lot of your employees, that they don't work, with the same speed that you're expecting them, or what you would do. So the employee situation became a big problem always. So I worked there at that shop for how many years? So 2011 to 2015. So it was 4 years I was there, and my landlord there was horrible. So it just so happens that I expanded down there. I went from 3,000 square feet to 7,000. There was adjoining shops that had just doors, and I could open them up, and now I get 7,000 square feet.
Nice.
So that was good. But I didn't really see how I was going to expand the business. And, it was always really on shaky ground, the whole deal. And, I knew I could train my employees. I got Jack, and Jack was from zero to what he learned from me. He was really good. He had an autistic eye, and but the only thing was he was really slow. So I had a problem with the landlord. The landlord was raising the rent, and the place was not premium whatsoever. And then it was a 30-mile drive every day, and I was coming home at like 12:30 at night. And so I had the opportunity to rent this building. It came up for rent right in the town one town over, into Charlton. and it's a 20,000 square foot building. And the landlord's an unbelievably good landlord. You know, he's been a landlord. He's about 8 months older than me, and I just don't have the money to buy a building. So I said, okay, I'm gonna rent from this guy, and he took a flyer on me. He had no idea how I was going to pay the bills. So I started renting here in 2015, and he gave me a break for like the first 6 months, but then the rubber had to hit the road.
Mhm.
And I somehow, I don't know how it happened, but next thing you know, I had a bunch of jobs in the shop, and I had 11 employees, and I couldn't do any work. I was monitoring what everybody was doing all the time, and usually it wasn't up to my snuff. So I quickly learned that if you act as the shop manager, they all hate you. And you need a shop manager. You know, if you watch the Boyd Coddington show, Dwayne was the shop manager. Everybody hated Dwayne. Well, if you're going to have an efficient shop, you need a bulldog like Dwayne in order to keep things going. And you got to stay impartial. You got to be like the Supreme Court. You got to weigh what Dwayne says versus what the employee says, and then you come out on top. If you act like Dwayne, the employees all hate you.
Right.
So that was a struggle and a real learning curve. And my skill set wasn't really being used. I was more managing at that time. So that went on for like 2 or 3 years. And slowly but sure, the attrition set in. So customers didn't want to spend money or whatever, and the job's finished. And no customer replaced the ones that got finished. And you know, next thing I know, I had 4 employees or 3 employees. So now I've been getting by with 2 employees with a couple part-timers here and there. So I have 2 full-time employees and 2 part-timers now.
And what did you prefer? Now that you've
Huh?
seen both sides of the coin, you had 11 people. Now
I
you've
would love to have a shop with like 15 people that had the mindset to learn more every day and to get better every day. But that's an impossible dream. That's what I found out. So my classes started in my 2-car garage with 3 people. I think the most I ever had was 5 people at my 2-car garage, and generally everybody left pretty happy. But then I had the classes down in Connecticut, and they got a little bit bigger. They got to 7 or 8 people. And now I'm in a 20,000 square foot building with a lot of cars in the shop and everything. And the biggest class I had was 23 people.
Yeah.
And it turns out that class was the most efficient class I've ever had. And it was just me. There was no helpers or anything. And, you know, I'd have to run 90 miles an hour to keep everybody happy. And the funny thing about teaching that I found was that nobody asked any questions. All through the years I taught, I could count on my hands how many people asked a good question. You know, they were just afraid to ask questions. I don't know what it is. And I'm like a question machine. If I went to any type of class, they would get so sick of me because I'd ask so many questions. It'd be, you know, I'd just bury them in questions.
Right.
And that's the way I learned. But the good thing about the classes was I learned to another level totally, because they made mistakes that I never made. And you have to learn how to correct those mistakes for each student. So it was a really fun process learning how to correct those mistakes. And I knew once I learned how to correct all those mistakes, my skill sets were getting better and better and better.
Sure.
You know, so, but the problem is, how do I apply my skill sets in a business that will make money? Because everybody thinks you're making a lot of money doing classes. Well, it's tough to make money doing classes too. Now, it was super disruptive because it took basically a week out of every month, because I had prep time before to set the shop up for the class, prep time and cleanup time after.
Yep.
And, you know, it meant moving jobs around, moving benches around. And I mean, I have a big shop, and I at that time I had like 12 English wheels. Now I got like 15 English wheels, and I got a power hammer I made, and you know, and I teach a method that's totally different than anybody else's. It's a method that I learned. And how did I learn it? Well, I learned it by observation. I learned how the English work. I learned how the Italians work, a little bit of how the French work, and how the Americans work. And I kind of, and then I had 25 years of making those Jag panels. So I put it all together and I got a pretty good system.
Yeah.
And I came up with a lot of innovations. One, the wide top wheel, and flexible shape patterns. The flexible shape patterns came up from when I was making the Jag pods. It's an amazing tool, and it's not used probably more than by 10% of the metal shaping community out. They probably never no idea about it. A lot of them don't have any idea about a wide top wheel, the advantages of it versus, to stand it. And a lot of them think that a cast English wheel is the way to go. And a lot of them think that you have to English wheel by doing pattern wheeling. And that's what the way I learned with John Glover was pattern wheeling.
Right.
And I tried pattern wheeling. I found it super boring. And I said, "Where's the power hammer at?" Because it's so boring. So I called it jazz wheeling, because when I found that I pattern wheeled, meaning all the tracks on the panel have to be closely spaced, just like mowing a lawn.
Mm-hmm.
And if I did that, I'd always end up with low spots here and there, and I'd have to learn how to correct them anyways. So I thought learning how to correct deficiencies in a panel was a better skill set than trying to perfect it right from the get-go.
Ah, interesting.
So I was blowing the panels out, shrinking and stretching them on my my Italian style power hammer. I built this really cool big power hammer. I never used it. I could sell it, but I didn't use it much in the classes. A lot of people wanted to see it, but I knew that they would never have the money or the space to put that up.
Yeah,
so
big.
I do still have it because I can shrink thicker metals with it, and I can use it for architectural stuff and sculptural stuff, which I've used it a little bit, but I hardly ever use it. And I don't use the Pullmax. I have a Pullmax. A friend of mine gave me a trunk machine, which is not as good as a Pullmax. I've had 3 Pullmaxes in the past. I sold them all. And I have 2 planishing hammers, and I only use the planishing hammer like 5% of the time. And a big discovery like 2 years ago was a small English wheel. I had one of my students was building an Alfa Romeo. In fact, you worked on, I think, part of the rear fender or something. And he said, if we had a small wheel, this would really help, because there's a lot of detail work. So I made up a little 2-inch upper die and a 2-inch lower die in a small little frame with about an 18-inch throat. It was a breakthrough.
Yeah.
It does exactly what the planishing hammer does, but so much better, because every time I used the planishing hammer, I walked away disappointed. It fixed one problem and created another. But it has its value. I still use it, but probably only 1% of the time. The Pullmax, I'm not a big guy on beads. Everybody's into beads, and the cars and stuff I worked on didn't have beads. So if I wanted to make a bead, yeah, I can do it on my tipping wheel. I can do it on a bead roller. I can do it on my trunk machine. So I have a couple of options. But I've had that trunk machine since like 2012. I bet you I haven't used it more than 3 hours since 2012.
I had Matt Salamanca on the show, and he said, "You want to get Ray really upset? Get him to talk about a Pullmax for a little while. Get him really fired up. Get him mad."
They're great machines, but I don't think you really need them. I always geared my class to the guy that's building his stuff at home, and he's got limited space, limited budget. And if you start filling your small space up with a Pullmax and a power hammer, you're not going to have any room to work, and you don't need it. You don't need it. And my biggest influence was probably how the Italians make the bodies. When I came to the realization that the Italians, they were really hammered. They had gone through the Depression. They had gone through Mussolini. They had gone through the war. And they come out of the war and they had nothing except for 2,000 years of skills that have been passed down through their family. So they have a culture similar to the Chinese, where it's bred into you almost. And they got a great aesthetic sense. All of Italy is beautiful. Everything's beautiful. The landscape's beautiful. The buildings are beautiful. The streets are beautiful. The women are beautiful. You name it. Everything's beautiful in Italy. So they revere beauty. So when it comes to cars, their cars are beautiful, and they learned through probably from the Roman days that you could do anything with sheet metal, and you don't need tools to do it. So they had a flat, big slab of metal. There was probably some World War II scrap that they ground flat, and that would be their planishing tool.
Yeah.
And then they had a big ass stump that might be 3 feet or 4 feet in diameter. That's their shrinking and stretching tool. And they had wooden mallets and a couple auto body tools, hammers, and a couple dollies, and a gas welding setup. And they could build anything.
Yeah.
All the great Ferraris and Maseratis and Lancias, they were all built. The ones that are most valuable were built by hand like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't only until the late 60s they started stamping stuff out. And they didn't stamp, the Italians didn't stamp a whole fender out. And it was mostly, fiat money that came in, or bigger contracts or whatever. And I just realized like a year ago. So I bought this auto body shop from Boston area out, and I got a brand new GTB fender from a 1966 Ferrari,
Mm-hmm.
and it was made by Pininfarina.
Yeah.
And I saw all the pieces in. I says, "Wow, they handmade all those pieces," and the welds were perfect, and they looked like they were fusion welds because there was little openings here and there. And at the time, I was doing a video on this Austin Healey shroud that I got from the same company. It was all dented so bad it was all wadded up,
Mm-hmm.
and I straightened it out. And in my comments of my YouTube channel, a guy said, "Well, Healey didn't make those shrouds for the Healey. Jensen did, and Jensen stamped them." So there was like 8 pieces in it, and I figured, look at that. They made little dies and they stamped sections, and then they jigged it up. I don't know if you've ever seen Mercedes or Porsche, how they put the panels together. They have these exoskeletons of steel,
Yeah.
and they got a little spot, and they got it all clamped together, and they gas weld them.
Yeah.
And that's probably what they did with the Jensen did with his Healey shrouds, these aluminum shrouds. And so after seeing that was stamped, it became obvious to me that that's what Pininfarina was doing on these quarter panel that I had. That they were partially stamped and then welded together, and that's how they got their productivity up. Because if you're building onesies or maybe 10 of something, it's very, very difficult to make money. And one of the best shops in Italy that had the boldest designs was Scaglietti's shop.
Sure.
Which he was a friend of Enzo's, and he got these juicy race car jobs. Enzo would have a chassis brought over there, and Scaglietti's shop would knock out a body in a week. There's probably 7 guys, and I had 2 Danish students come. And they told me they went to Italy year after year after year, and they couldn't get into any of the shops. And they found this guy to open the doors for everybody. And they met this guy, Giancarlo Guerra, who was like the #1 hire at Scaglietti.
Oh, wow.
And he was the one that actually built like the GTO and the Testarossa and the California, all these icon Ferrari designs that are worth multiple millions. So in the case of the GTO Ferrari, we're talking it's potentially $100 million car now. And he was doing the work. Scaglietti got the credit.
Right.
How was he doing the work? There's like 4 videos online on YouTube. And if you know Italian, it's even better. But there's one, I think it's translated or something, but it's an interview of Giancarlo Guerra in 2019, just before he died. And he takes credit for all those cars, and I don't doubt it, because after he left Scaglietti, he started his own shop, and he had an assembly line, and these 2 Danish guys took the pictures, and they gave me all the pictures showing Guerra's shop and assembly line and making GTOs and Testarossas, and they were using lesser dolly Ferrari running gear and chassis and converting them into the more valuable GTOs and stuff. So,
Yeah.
the Italian method was the one that held out the most appeal to me. It's slow, but they made up for it by having 7 people do it. And I read that it took more time to actually do the body work after the body was built. They filled them. And I don't know if they were using Bondo at that time, because Bondo came out in the mid 50s. But they had other ways of filling the bodies.
Right.
But it took more hours to actually get the body smooth and painted than it did to actually make the aluminum panels.
Really?
And they used a wire form system to create the lines, and then they used the Superleggera system, which everybody copied from Touring Coachworks. And
is this why
yeah.
you're so pro wire form over a wood buck?
Oh yeah. The wood bucks. The mystery of the wood bucks is also when people say wood buck, they
Wood
think
station buck.
it's a wood station buck and then a wood buck, totally different animals.
Yes.
Because a wood buck that's made out of hardwood that's used as a hammer form to ensure symmetry and to ensure the parts really fit, that's a totally different animal. Like, for instance, the Cobras were made on a solid wooden buck. The back end and the front end were solid wood. And you've ever seen the still existing wood Cobra buck? It's all splintered up, and they fixed it with Bondo through the years and stuff. And there's just so much to learn from both the English and the Italians. And the Americans, pretty much coach building went away, except for a few outliers. It was like Durham. It lasted till like 70 in Pennsylvania, and then there was a couple guys on the West Coast and a couple guys in Indianapolis. Those are the only guys that knew how to do anything.
Did the Americans really modernize the stamping process for production purposes, whereas the Europeans maybe kept the coach building alive?
Stamping came out from the Dodge brothers. When the Dodge brothers and Ford broke up in like 1914 or something, the Dodge brothers were machinists, and they saw that you had to mechanize as much as possible. And it was a company called Budd Manufacturing in Philadelphia, and they built these big stamping presses, and that's where it all started. And so the Budd presses eventually migrated to Germany. Germany became the leader in stamping, and then it migrated to Japan. They're the leaders in stamping, but now it's probably Chinese. The Chinese are building more cars than anybody today, and it's all stamped. So going back to the economics of building hand-built cars, the Italians could tell you the most, because they built a lot of them, and nobody got rich. All the companies went defunct. If you didn't transition from doing onesies and twosies to hundreds and then to hundreds of thousands, and the only way you can do that is with lots of capital. So, those cars that they made, the Italians made the most beautiful designs, probably the most hand-built cars of anybody that built hand-built cars, and they proved to be the most valuable. And the workmanship on them is not top-notch. And the collectors like the fact that it's not top-notch. They like to see the human mistakes. I don't get that. I'm always going by the designer's intent. Designers do not see imperfections in their finished cars. They want them to be absolutely perfect. But collectors go into numbers, and they go, I never got into that mindset whatsoever.
Right.
The big concours like Amelia Island and Pebble Beach, I do not understand that at all. The fact that, I've had 61 years of experience in this collector car business, and I can look at a car and I know absolutely nothing about it, even though I know a lot about it. So how can these guys they got a suit on and a hat and they got a clipboard, and they're going to be judging the quality of your restoration? To me, it's just madness. I just don't get it, So that's a thing that's part of the value of the cars. If they win Pebble Beach, they're worth more or something. I don't know.
So when you see coach builders working either solo or small shops, or even some of the larger shops with bigger brand names, I mean, when you think about the way that they're building cars and the way that they're coach building, do you see that as a concern? based on the current economics of the industry, or how do you see that?
Well, it's you can make a living, but you can't make anything more than just a living. You can't build a business. The real estate business, you have to follow the fundamentals of what the interest rates are, what the land prices are, what the material costs are, how much your employees are going to cost you. But there's no problem, or there's less problems getting an employee. And as the prices go up, everybody gets acclimated to the higher price, and you can expand your business. So if you wanted to become a real estate owner of 100 apartment buildings, you could. My landlord started when he was like 18, and he owns like literally hundreds and hundreds of acres of land, and he does very, very good. He's like 8 months older than me. I think he hits 74 now. And he owns like 4 industrial parks, and he invests. He nourishes and invests in a lot of his tenants and people that buy buildings from him. So one example is IPG. IPG was started by this guy Valentin, who was a Russian who immigrated from. It might have been after the Soviet Union collapsed, and he had laser technology in his head. And he came to this area because in this area we have a thing called American Optical, which was founded in like 1880, and they were like the first American mass produced maker of eyeglasses.
Right.
So they had a lot of optical engineers and stuff at AO, and because of that, there was like dozen spin-off companies around in the area, and one of them is laser. And this guy Valentin came over, and he needed a space, and he needed funding. And my landlord came up with like $100,000 himself, and got $100,000 from 9 of his friends. So that was the first $1 million of seed money. And I think my landlord still has that stock, which is the premium grade stock. The company is now $1 billion company. It's on the New York Stock Exchange, and they make these IPG laser welders, which are $30,000 and maybe $35,000 with all the bells and whistles. And that's the new thing that's going to make a big difference in the craft, is the welding quality will go up, I believe. And I'm going to get a chance to use one of those pretty soon. It should be.
Are you familiar with the tech and the way that it works yet, or it's still too new? Are you familiar with the technology and the way that it works, or is it still too fresh?
just watching videos. That's it. I've seen a bunch of videos, and it seems to be the way to go. So I've got a potential job coming on that's an aluminum boat job. It's a 48-foot boat, and he's going to buy. He brought it up. He says, "I'm buying an IPG welder." So I'm going with him and go test it out to make sure we can weld this aluminum alloy he's getting, which is a salt-resistant alloy. So I would love to have a shop full of scratch-built cars, but I just don't get anybody calling or knocking on my door to build a $400,000 to $600,000 build. Right. I am doing a build right now of a Ferrari for a guy in Florida, and I'm doing it basically for peanuts. But I can replicate that job, and that will lead to something. And it's really fun doing it. It's a GTO, Ferrari GTO, but it's a 330, which was the last run of the GTOs, the last 5, I think. And this one was a one-off. It's got a 102-inch wheelbase, so it's made as a passenger car, not a race car. So they give you a better space and room for your legs, and less heat concentration in the cabin, and with a 102-inch wheelbase, you get a better ride, and it's the proportions are better. It's a much better looking car. We're building the chassis first. I have an employee that's building the chassis. I consult with him, and next step is going to be doing the wire form on that and doing the panels. Yeah. And I'm thinking I was going to use 063 to do the panels, but my friend Solace, he does the Series 2 Cobras.
Yeah, beautiful work.
He's probably one of the best guys on the planet. He's a super perfectionist. If you've seen his work, it's just mind blowing how good it is. Well, he told me he's using 080, and I've used the 080, and I just had some students from RM Restoration up in Canada, come down, and they were using 080. So, and 080 moves pretty easy. If you need to, you can anneal it. So I might do that body in aluminum. I mean, in
Why
080 aluminum.
why 080? Is it because it gives you file room if you need to
It
file
gives
it,
you
or
file room. It's not that more difficult with 17,000 thicker. It
yeah.
gives you that little bit extra. And, it's a little difficult to wire edge it, but you still can wire edge it, not too hard by hand,
Mhm.
So, uh, building the Ferrari, I haven't publicized it all because I don't want a phone call from a lawyer saying, no, you can't do that or something like that. I don't know if you followed the case of the guy in Sweden who built a C-type Jag. He always wanted one, his lifelong Jag guy.
Yeah.
And he built a C-type Jag, and then Jaguar went after him.
Yeah.
And they haven't done that to anybody else, but they've changed hands a bunch of times. I don't know who initiated it, but they went after this guy. He was just, maybe an upper middle class guy. He had $1 million worth of assets. He had to use all his assets to fight Jaguar.
Right.
Well, he ended up winning in court, but I'm sure it was a Pyrrhic victory because he lost like 2 years worth of his time, and I'm sure it was not a profitable deal in any way for him.
Right.
So, and Mercedes, I've heard many stories of if you bring a Mercedes that's a replica into Germany, they find it, they'll crush it.
Oh, yeah.
So, they'll go after you. So, I'd love to do icon cars and replicate them. And I'm doing it with the GTO, but it's not going to be my car. But if you do, I've discovered AI design.
That's right.
And I've been on the AI design kick for about 8 months now. I started, I think, about November or so. At first, I had Mark do it because Mark knew how to run Mark is my office employee, and he does general work around the shop and stuff, and he's really good with computers. And I went off on that tangent of the AI design, and I said, this is the coolest thing that ever came down the pike. And I mean, some of the AI designs are horrible. If you see the initial output that it sends to you, it's all in the cloud, and you tell it what you want, and it, I can do 40 designs in a matter of like minutes.
Yeah.
And of the 40 designs, I only get one or two that are of any value. The rest of them are really horrible. The proportions are off. They're just really bizarre stuff. But then I've learned how to run the program. I had Mark using the program for like 2 months. And it was all through Discord, which is a social media site.
Mhm.
And I didn't understand why that, but we started using it so much they made us alpha users. So now we use it right on Midjourney's page, and
Wow.
it's pretty simple to use. It's not difficult in any way.
So when
But
you go in and do this, like for an onlooker, they see something that you're posting on your Facebook, right? They say, "Oh,
yeah,
hey, nice car, beautiful car." So on the back end, how does that actually look when you're telling the computer, I would like a roadster of this type of era"? Like how do you prompt the
yeah,
computer?
you just write in stuff like that, and you don't know what you're going to get.
Hmm.
And the funny thing is, if you do like I do sometimes 20, sometimes not too often, but I can do 40 at a time.
Yeah.
I'll do 20, and there might be one in the beginning and one in the end. Why on the beginning and end, I don't know. But I'm beginning to believe that I'm one of their power users.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine anybody who uses Midjourney more than me, because I've literally done hundreds of thousands of designs, hundreds of thousands. And I might have got 1,000 keepers now.
Right.
And I'm building a library, and I'm trying to monetize it. So I'm going to try to sell prints, and it might be unsuccessful. I don't know. But the next step is to get 3D files so you can 3D print them. And 3D printing of them, you could 3D print a buck if you have a big enough 3D printer.
Yep.
Or if you're doing it in scale. And, it came to the realization, I mean, somebody actually mentioned, boy, I'd like to make models of these, and it kind of went in one ear and out the other. But, after a while, I says, man, modeling is the way to go, and it also factors into the time we're at is that, one of the great things about my class is I got all this feedback from people. I had people all over the world take my class,
Mhm.
and they would tell me that you can't build a scratch build car in Europe. You can't build a scratch build car here or there in Australia, New Zealand. They just won't let you do it.
Right.
So there's so many limitations, and the government limitations are getting ramped up more and more and more. And it's going to be here. We can do stuff, and you can actually make 400 cars a year that do not have to pass crash testing because of SEMA. SEMA lobbied the Congress for years and years and years, and got that legislation passed about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
That you could make 400 cars as a small producer. You have to have the emissions of the motor that you put into it, but it doesn't have to pass crash. Now, as far as the liability, if you scratch build a car, I think the liability is on you if you sell it.
Yeah.
So you have to have some kind of long-term liability, some kind of written agreement between the buyer and seller too, but those don't hold water generally. But the best thing to do is make the damn thing safe,
Yeah, really.
So if you're going to scratch build a car, you make it safe. So, I would love to spend the rest of my days scratch building cars, and I put up like all these designs on Facebook, and I expected, a phone call here and there. I've had 2 phone calls, and both of them were not real. They basically didn't understand the process and the cost of it and stuff. So, I mean, to hire somebody to build the car for you, depending on the complexity, it's a $400,000 minimum, maybe 300.
Yeah.
It depends on if it's a simple design. If it's no fenders, it's an Indy Roadster or something like that. You can maybe do that for 200,000.
Right.
But if you're doing a really long wheelbase car with a really elaborate leather interior and fancy wheels and everything else, it could be $500,000-$600,000 because the paint's expensive, all the materials are expensive. So
now, what about reskinning an existing car? Taking a BMW Z3 or a Miata or something like this, and
there's a guy, Jim Simpson, that I met. He called me and introduced himself. I've seen his work on Facebook, and he's been doing that for years.
Right.
He uses Miatas, and he's done aluminum bodies, and he might have done steel bodies too, but he prefers fiberglass because the price point of the finished product is low enough.
Yeah.
So he predominantly does fiberglass, which he's not happy with, but that's. And I really don't want to swallow that plateful. I don't like fiberglass, and I don't want to work around the limitations of the existing chassis. I want to build my own chassis, which is a whole art form in itself.
Right.
And that's still to be explored to me, and you can learn a ton. But I don't think I'm going to ever get the chance to do it because. You got to find that customer that's willing to spend $400,000-$600,000, and that translates sometimes into he's got to come up with $30,000 to $50,000 every month for 2 years or whatever to pay for that car, and it's a crapshoot for him. If he buys a Dave Kindig Corvette that's made of fiberglass, you've seen those. He's making a series of 53 Corvettes. He's getting like $500,000 for them at auction. And they're done really well. Everything Kindig does is really well. But the aluminum one that they just did, that won the Riddler, I heard the number $3 million bandied around building that.
Yeah.
Well, if you've got a $3 million budget, I mean, I could train somebody who's an absolute newbie to make a product as good as what Kindig could do, if you got that kind of budget. So it's all about the budget more so than the skill sets or the shop or anything else. If you've got a budget, you can make things happen. So, go ahead.
In your opinion, what's more important, the design or the fabrication?
I think the design is more important than anything. The design has to be superb. And I think a lot of people, want to scratch build cars or even hot rod projects that are not up to snuff. And that's what the Italians, you can learn so much from the Italians. They didn't compromise on the design. Now, there's some flub Italian designs. There's a few of them I've seen through the years. They're just horrible beasts. But most of the Italian designs, I mean, you could spend all day just looking at little details. I had a Oscar. Are you familiar with Oscar at all?
No, I'm not. What is it?
At my shop down to Connecticut, a local restorer, Gary Cove, he had a customer had one of these Oscars. Oscar was the name of a Italian company. There was the Maserati brothers. There was like 4 or 5 Maserati brothers that started Maserati, and they weren't good businessmen, and they got into trouble. and they worked for the new owner. They had to sell it to a wealthy industrialist, and they advised them and stuff. And then after they got their 7-year freedom after working for the new owner, they started Oscar. And they made passenger cars, they made race cars, they had unbelievably nice cars.
Right.
And nice designs, and they didn't make the bodies. I forget who made the bodies. But this was like a 1960 Oscar or something he brought down to the shop, and I was just blown away. Because I'm really familiar with how a Dusenberg is put together. I know, and that was stamped and, really advanced methods, whereas the Italians used a lot of handwork. They didn't have the money for that stuff, so they had a beautiful tube frame chassis, and you could just look at every little bracket and the job that bracket was doing. And to me, that has as much as important as the shape of the fender.
Right.
So the whole picture, the frame, the way the motor is put in it, the balance of the car, all that is so important. And this is the enticing and intoxicating thing of building your own car. And all of my classes, I've really tried to tell people, forget about that 32 Ford you're building. You're only building that because you saw it in a magazine.
Right.
Build something really cool like the Italians did. And a few of them it's gone through, and I've got probably about a dozen of my students that have built some amazing cars. And, I think that's the fun part, because this is ultimately is a hobby.
Yeah.
But it's a hobby that you want to try to not be cash negative. You want to be cash positive.
That's right.
And you can be cash positive, And there's people like Chris Runge, who is a great example of somebody with a lot of ambition and really good marketing skills, didn't know anything. And he started out, he was fearless, and he's built, 14 cars now or something. And his quality is really,
Chris was on the show. He was a terrific guest.
Oh, I haven't seen that interview yet. Yeah. So he's made some really nice looking cars, and he's in a really good market, the Porsche market. That's one of the best markets. So I had the same idea of doing that, making a series of cars, but I didn't know how. I don't have any marketing skills whatsoever, absolute zero. So he's very good at marketing, and he's younger. He's got a really good situation, and he's got family that's helping out. His son is helping him out.
Yeah.
I have two sons. One's not interested in what I do. The other son's autistic. So I never had any family other than my wife. My wife handles the books and does the sales of all the stuff we make, the shrinking discs and English wheel stuff and stuff. But it contrasts quite a bit from when my grandfather's. And my grandfather's, he had a lot of family members working at the shop, and that made a big difference. If you can have family members, the economics of it, it's really a tough sledding to try to build a series like Chris Runge is doing. I think he's successful at it, and maybe he's making good money. More power to him. He's using AI design in some of his stuff now. It's the way to go. It's a creativity and a productivity tool. And I get really kind of miffed and pissed at the comments that I get on Facebook, because people are so insensitive. It's just, I can't believe, didn't their mothers tell them that if you don't have something good to say, don't say it, So, I put these designs, I think I have a really good eye, because I've looked at cars for all these years, and I've looked at the top end of cars. And I come up with some pretty good designs. I know, okay, I could make it better, but I don't want to spend 2 hours on each design because I can't do it. I can't afford to do that. I know I can make it better. So I put it up, and they'll go, "Oh, the wheel's too close to the fender. It's going to rub." No shit, and these aren't build plans. What I'm putting up a concept plan. It's an image. It's a stimulator. It's to get your juices flowing. All right. So if you're going to build it, you have to make all the little corrections, because building a car is a packaging problem. It has to be structurally sound, but you have to package all the components that are going to go into it. And today, if you're going to build a car and you're going to charge $400,000 for it, it's got to run and drive really nice. So that means you don't want a vintage experience. You don't want oil leaks. You don't want all the problems associated with the earlier cars. You want it to be super dependable. And that means you have to factor all that in. And so it's a big, complex problem to make a car, but a beautiful problem. So I see the economy the way it is now. Is the economy in the U.S. is definitely on the downswing. The inflation rate is not a good thing. It worked for the car collecting back in the 70s. I saw it happen at my grandfather's because people would buy a Stutz and then they'd restore it and it cost so much. But by the time the Stutz was done 1 or 2 years later, depending on how fast he wanted it done in another shop, it had appreciated in value because of the inflation, and the hurt of restoring the car didn't hurt as much. So even though it was illusionary, there's the value in a collector car is there's most of it is inflation, and some of it is a core value. And that, collectors are at the top of the pyramid, are only going to collect cars that have core values, meaning they were very rare to begin with. They're highly desirable because of the mechanics and the aesthetics of them.
Yep.
And, those are the ones that are worth a lot of money. They have provenance. They were involved in a race. They had a wealthy owner in the past. Well, that's one of the question marks of AI designed cars. Are they going to have any value? But you have the example of Chris Runge's I've been heard he's getting like $300,000 for his cars, which is a good little number. It's a small wheelbase car. Maybe he's making some money there. I don't know. And then Kindig is getting $500,000 for these fiberglass Corvettes. But that's a TV show. TV show is crazy. It pumps the numbers up like unbelievable. So it doesn't mean that you know more if you have a TV show. It just means you have a TV show, and your finances are a lot better if you have a TV show, especially it has longevity like Kindig's had. So it gets a regular, what do they call it, syndicated. When it gets syndicated, you can make a lot of money. And I think it's 5 years or so before it gets syndicated, or 200 episodes or something like that. Yeah. Which that's a hard threshold to cross too, So there's been a lot of failure TV shows. I've entertained the idea of having a TV show, but no opportunities ever presented themselves either, So.
Yeah. Ray, this has been a lot of fun just to be able to have a conversation with you for the last little while. And your knowledge is so vast and so deep. And that's one of the things that I always respected about you, was that you knew where we've gone. Right. And then you've taken that history and you've said, okay, how can I adapt it to modern times? And even coming from, the eras of the Dusenbergs and boat restorations and so forth, up to today, where you can sit in your office and hammer out 40 AI designs of beautiful cars in a microsecond. It's amazing. And you've adopted that tech and you brought it in and it's really incredible. So from me to you, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a treat. Where can people find out more about you and what you're doing with ProShaper?
Well, I have 3 websites. We have a new website, which is only about 1% done. Mark makes the websites, and it's for selling T-shirts and prints of my AI design cars. That's called designbuilddrive.com. And then I also have www.proshaper.com. That's my metal shaping tools. And I do now have the 30-day class. If you're interested in the 30-day class, you really have to call me and we can discuss it. And then I have my YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/ProShaper. And I have 315 videos. And I've been away from my YouTube videos for like 6 weeks or so now, because I'm doing this architectural job, which is eating up all my time. And after I get that done, then I got to get back to the video. And I'm doing an AI Alfa Romeo design. I'm wireforming it the way the Italians would do it. And I think it's the most fun. But I think AI is going to, within 2 years, maybe in a year, there'll be AI, might not be Mid-Journey, but there'll be another company that'll start up, because literally $1 trillion is going to go into AI development. And an AI company will pair that will put out a CAD drawing. And so you basically put in all your verbal prompts and then your dimensions that you want, the color. You just totally define the thing, and it'll spit out a 3D revolved CAD model, which you can do anything you want with. That's a build model. And then it can get modified probably with the program too, because everything you build the first time or the first concept has got a lot of problems that need to be amended. So I think AI holds the greatest promise, but it's a productivity and a creativity tool, and anybody that's in the business should be playing with it. And anybody who wants to build one of my designs can go on and look at my designs on Facebook and copy one of them. There's no copyright infringement or anything like that. But now I'm attempting to have a company make a 3D file, and I'm really interested in, especially if the economy crunches up really bad, building models creates a price point that everybody can afford. So, there's been some really famous modelers that have made classic cars through the years. I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but they've done these superb jobs where they use brass and they hammer all the fenders and the body, and they make the motors, and it's just unbelievable. There are 1,000 hours in them or more. And all those skill sets are the exact same skill sets you would do if you were building the car full scale. So modeling brings the price point down quite a bit. I could teach classes on how to do that over the internet. So I think I'm going to evolve with AI, and furniture holds a lot of appeal to me too. You don't have to worry about roadworthiness with furniture and stuff. So I don't know how many more years I got. My retirement plan is my last heartbeat. So I love the work. I mean, I work from 9 a.m. to 11 o'clock every single day, 7 days a week. Because it's fun, So
Awesome.
The question is how to make money at it. That's the question.
That's the question. Well, happy Independence Day. Thanks for tuning into the Sheet Metal Shaping Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, follow, and subscribe, and we will see you on the next episode.